everybody. Welcome to the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report. Today we have Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, who you may remember we had as a guest a few years ago. Rabbi Weinblatt is the founding chairman of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, a diverse network of over 2,000 rabbis from across North America dedicated to supporting Israel and promoting Jewish unity. Known as the Startup Rabbi, he founded Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Potomac, Maryland in 1988, which grew to one of the area's leading conservative synagogues and now serves as its Rabbi Emeritus. As a respected leader and advocate, Rabbi Weinblatt has held senior roles in national Jewish organizations, including the Jewish Federations of North America, the Rabbinical Assembly, and the AIPAC organization, which many of you are familiar with. He has offered opening prayers before the U.S. Congress and the Maryland State Legislature, and his insights are frequently sought out by political and Jewish leaders alike, and folks like us at the Jerusalem Connection. As an author, educator, and speaker, he has written books and serves on advisory boards for several prominent Jewish and pro-Israel organizations. Rabbi Weinblatt and his wife Simcha have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Rabbi Weinblatt, I am so happy that you could join us here. We are honored to have your wisdom and your expertise today. You know, you've been very active for years in the community, really just leading the charge for the Jewish community to embrace their identity, to know their history, and to support Israel from a Zionist perspective, as well as combat antisemitism and raise awareness for safety and security. You had a great article published on April 26th in Newsweek magazine. I encourage everybody to Google that article. I will put the link in the show notes. And you also have been addressing your own community leaders in the importance of leading the charge to espouse truth and solid teaching to the community, the Jewish community, and also the rest of us about what Israel and the Jewish people really are, and combat the lies and misinformation that has led to an epidemic of anti-Semitic activities abroad and here in America. So I really want to pick your brain on this issue. Tell us about your work in communicating with your rabbinical leaders and those in your community, and what your message is to them about combating this false narrative and this hostility that's creeping up.
Amy, it's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers and listeners again. Thank you so much for the invitation. Um, I think we are at a very critical time. First of all, it is just, to me, unfathomable. I really cannot understand if somebody were to be observing from Mars how this happened. That is, that Israel was attacked. There was a massacre by Hamas. 1,200 people were killed. There were hundreds that were taken captive. There was a stealing of things in the kibbutzim, they're burning, all the atrocities. And then somehow the day after that, already the demonstrations against Israel started. So quite clearly, there are other forces at work here. I hate to sound conspiratorial. I really do. But we have to recognize that this is not just spontaneous, the outpouring of demonstrations against Israel. There are forces behind that who have been trying to defeat Israel. And if they can't win on the battlefield, they'll win by terrorist attacks. If they can't win by that, they'll try and defeat us in other ways, and in the arena, a public square arena. So I just recently completed a conference of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which I chair, and we called it the Eighth Front, what rabbis need to know and what rabbis need to do. We call it the Eighth Front because the Seventh Front war Israel has been fighting for the last couple of years. The Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and that's just the letter H. Iran and in the West Bank and elsewhere. But in addition to those active fronts militarily, there's this Eighth Front, which is the domain of the public arena. It's what's happening on college campuses and elsewhere. And unfortunately, people don't always know don't have the facts. They're not equipped to be able to counter all of these things that are charges that are made against Israel. So by way of example, the word genocide is just tossed around. And I often want to ask people, do you have any idea what the word genocide actually means? It means to seek to abolish a population. And that has not been what Israel has done. It was the first country in history where they actually fed the people they were fighting against. It's the first country in history where there actually were means that were taken to try and limit the amount of civilian casualties, even as Hamas implanted and embedded themselves within civilians. So I think we have a story to tell. It's not being told for whatever reason. It's not being told in social media and the general media. And that's why I think our role as rabbis, and for that matter, those who are listening who are pastors as well, have such a responsibility. We have to be committed to truth. We have to be committed to not. One of the things I said in my talk to our rabbis at our conference was, and to others as well, we have to make sure that our relationship and feelings about Israel are not defined or determined by Israel's detractors. And that's part of the problem, is that Israel's detractors are out there in full force. The New York Times accepts what Hamas says unquestioningly and publishes it, and people begin to assume that must be truth. We have that obligation, whether it's rabbis, whether it's pastors, whether it's educators, to get the message out of to dispel and respond and to rebut and refute the lies and distortions that are out there.
I mean, that is so true. And what you're saying is that when those demonstrations, they were locked and loaded hours after October 7th.
Yeah.
These things were planned. And to your point about the lies and misinformation that's being so easily swallowed by not just young adults, but all ages of adults, I feel like that was 20 or 30 years in the making with a substandard educational system that didn't, I mean, I'm talking about the Jewish education, I'm talking about public education in general. So, for example, I saw some recent statistics, and I'm not having the numbers correctly, but out of, people polled under 30 years old, they didn't know any of the actual facts of the real Holocaust, the genocide of the 20th century. And there's been in the education community, not just the higher ed, but 12 teacher colleges and whatnot, this sort of the subtlety and now not so subtle downplaying of Israel and its actual historical foundings. And in the Christian community, that is what I can speak to, there's been a complete omission of the biblical foundation of the Jewish people and their covenant with their inherited land. So I feel like if we had a generation of people that knew the truth and were confident in the truth, both the historical and the contemporary, then as these crazy news cycles come in from the now disgraced, I say, New York Slimes, it would just be rejected, right? You would go, oh, they're crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. But that's not the case. The case is that it is being swallowed as gospel. So, what are your thoughts about the professors and the teachers and the news articles that are feeding in? I'd say some of these reporters and teachers are ignorant, and some of them do have sinister motives. What is your solution or your message to rabbis and for that matter, pastors to make sure they get ahead of it?
So clearly there is a momentum right now. And that momentum is a tide that is turning not in our favor in terms of those who love and understand and support Israel. So I think we have to counter it. And we have to counter it straight on. We have to fortify our congregants, our those who will listen to the message about the truth. You've mentioned about the schools. Part of it is a lack of education, both within the context of a lack of awareness. But the truth of the matter is that there currently are efforts to bring anti-Semitic teachings into school curriculums, to bring anti-Israel kinds of teachings, which totally distort the truth of history. All we want is truth. That's all. No one's saying that Israel's perfect. In fact, one of the things that I say is we don't love Israel because she is perfect, nor do we need Israel to be perfect for us to love her. The message there is one of the covenantal relationship between God and the people of Israel as defined on the land of Israel. The message is the historic connection to the land of Israel. The Jews are the original inhabitants of that land who have returned to that land. And so the charges that are made are so preposterous. We touched upon genocide just a few moments ago. How about the charge of colonialism? That makes no sense. Colonialism, first of all, who sent the Jews to settle in Israel? And then who, if that charge is true, who were the Jews then sending the resources back to in a European country? It's just preposterous. We were coming back in the 1800s, the to a land which Jews had never abandoned, had always lived in. We were coming back to create a homeland because for 2,000 years, it was always ruled by other empires who were not indigenous to the place, who were not autonomous. The only time Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was under the autonomous reign of the people who lived there is when it was in the hands of the Jewish people. Others, there were outside intruders. They were the colonialists. They were the ones who invaded, whether it was the Ottoman Turks, whether it was the Crusaders, whether it was the during the Byzantine period, whether it was the Mamelukes, any other time. And so all one needs to do is to just study a little bit. But unfortunately, history is not people's strong suit. And so there again, that's part of our responsibility. We're also dealing with short attention spans. We're also dealing with all of the misinformation that's put out on platforms such as TikTok and by now it's been overstated the way the algorithms work to try and then multiply and bring about even more of the negativity, which is unbased, not based in any kind of a truth. We also now have individuals who are using their public platforms, people who at one time had been sympathetic to Israel, such as Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly. I'm I don't want to make any accusations here, but I think it's kind of interesting that they suddenly have changed their tune. I think it'd be interesting. People talk about Jewish influence. I think it'd be wonderful. I think we need to look into the influence of foreigners in terms of how they are financing and paying specifically countries like Qatar and the actions of other nations and forces who want to change the public opinion, the public dialogue. They're funding many of these different, they're on college campuses. There are centers for Arab studies. There are centers for money that's being thrown into universities, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it does have an impact. And when someone who speaks who has a DR in front of their name as if they as a professor, it has a certain bit of credibility that people just assume is true. So it is our work is cut out for us, Amy.
It is. And what's alarming to me is the sort of the appeal to the young people is that, young people are searching for purpose, they're searching for meaning, they want to feel like they're doing good things and they're contributing to society. And we had a lot of different issues in our social landscape over the last 15 years that people grabbed onto, and some of them sincerely and some of them insincerely, and some of them completely legitimate, like, race relations and those kinds of things. But in that virtue signaling, like reposting something or showing up somewhere to hold a sign, somehow after October 7th, and maybe you can give us your thoughts on this, the idea of being violent or calls for violence somehow became fashionable or acceptable or a sign of being on the good side. So why is there this tipping point of just this vitriolic intimidation and hostility that takes to the streets against a very minority? I mean, in America, we got 2% of our population at best is Jewish, and they're not peppered all over the country. There's communities in New York and LA and Pennsylvania and other places, and they seem to get this target on them, and they're not even Israeli, and yet it's met with acceptance. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
It is very disturbing to see what's going on in the terms of the kinds of issues that you referred to. From one, there is such a distinction. In other words, that when you say about violent acts or things like that, or just there's an assumption that Jews are fair game, that pro-Israel people are fair game, that Zionists are fair game, whether it's in terms of trying to cancel a pro-Israel speaker someplace. Or here's the thing, the person doesn't even need to be pro-Israel. It
Right.
could just be an Israeli singer. It could just be a Jewish bakery. And all of a sudden, then there are efforts to try and boycott or shut that down. So there really is a manifestation now of this hatred that has now come to the surface. Hatred against Jews, and almost as if it's permissible, almost as if it's to be understood and tolerated. It is not. It is unacceptable, and it must be rejected at all costs. The discrimination, the intimidation. Jewish students on college campuses report many of them are prouder than ever to be Jewish. And on the other hand, there are those who, while they are very proud, feel they must hide that pride, hide their identity, because otherwise they will be taunted and tormented and bullied or intimidated or isolated and ostracized on their college campuses. So the only response to that is we need our allies. We need people to stand with us. We need people to speak out against these kinds of actions. As you said, we are such a very small percentage of the population. Similarly, the land of Israel constitutes something like less than 0.1% of the entire landmass of the entire world. Within the context of, if you, people should look at a map sometime. One of the things we often say is that Israel is so small of a country you can't even write the name of the country in it. But
It's in
maybe you
the
go like,
ocean, in the
there's
Mediterranean.
more than often than not, it's got to be in the ocean. So look at Israel as opposed to the landmass that surrounds it. That in and of itself tells a story. That in and of itself says something. And then we have the contributions historically as well as today that Israel and Israelis have made to improve the betterment of society as well as what Jews have done. That's all we really want to do. Our mission is here on earth to be able to make the world a better place, to be able to fulfill God's vision. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we are so targeted.
I mean, I personally do believe it's got a spiritual element to it because it's like when you're dealing with these extremists and loud voices that are so anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and just are calling for the erasure of the nation, let alone the people. It's almost like there's no rationality there whatsoever. It has to be something that's deeper than any human logic or human emotion. So I'm wondering.
Excuse me, Amy, when I spoke recently, briefly at the Israel Allies Caucus in Washington, I mentioned I asked, what did these countries have in common? And I mentioned Israel, Pakistan, Iran, Algeria. I mentioned 15 different countries, India. And the thing they all have in common is that they were all created in the 20th century. Yet there's only one of those countries whose existence constantly is questioned, constantly must be defended. And again, it just points to the issue that you're raising.
Well, and if, like you said, going back to your idea of looking at the map, we have approximately 15 million or so Jewish people on the planet, and maybe 7 or 8 million in Israel. And then if you look at the map, the entirety, that whole block of the map, if you made Israel blue and everything that was Muslim or Islamic red, they're surrounded by 58 million, I think, or more Islamic countries and Islamic citizens. And in those countries, all the Jews were expelled definitely by the middle of the
My
20th.
wife, her family is from Iraq. They had lived there for thousands of years, and yet the Jews of Iraq were all expelled. And what happened is she came to Israel as a baby, and she and her family lived in a tent in what's called a ma'abara, a transit camp. They lived there for the first few years of her life, and then eventually they were settled. One of the things is there was definitely a population exchange in 1948 to 51 or so, and there were hundreds of thousands of Arabs who left the land of Israel. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews who left the land, the Arab lands where they lived for hundreds and thousands of years. The difference is that Israel absorbed those people. Those
Mhm.
people are now contributing to society. They're holding positions in government and elsewhere. They were integrated into the population. And yet, those who left Israel were held, many of them to this day are held in refugee camps, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Jordan, where they're not allowed to become citizens, by the way, even though they share the same language, even though they share the same culture, even though they share the same religion. It's the only place where that happens, by the way. And as a result, part of the problem also is the way the United Nations is set up. There is one major United Nations refugees department for all 15 million or whatever number, actually it's not big, more like 150 million refugees throughout the entire world. And then there's also one other whole operation just for Palestinian refugees. It's the only one like that, and their refugee is defined, unlike the others, as going on to the second and the third generation. So there are people who were not born 78 years ago, who have yet still have this refugee status, who still are then treated as refugees, even though it is an anomaly and should not be the case. That also helps to feed the ongoing aspect of maintaining the conflict. I want to say one other thing, Amy, as you talk about the rest of the Arab world and the Muslim world. I think it's a critical point right now for them, and that is that they can take one of two directions. Either there are those who wish to move forward and to benefit from the technological revolution of the 21st century. Those would be countries such as the UAE, Bahrain, and others who have joined the Abraham Accords and who have said, we're not turning our back to reality and to modernity. And then there are those who want to bring the Muslim world and the rest of the world with them back to the 7th century. And that, of course, is what we see with Iran and with the mullahs who are there, who are determined and who are wish to impose their way of a backward, even Middle Ages kind of a way of life on the rest of the world. And so I think one of the questions is, when do people want to be in the West enablers of the positive moves forward towards peace, towards tolerance and cooperation? Or do they want to be enablers towards the intolerance and to the backwardness of the Shiites who want to take it back to the 7th century?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. When you try to talk to these protesters in America, these college students, and they want, to free Palestine, and Palestine needs to get their state back or something, which they never had in the first place. My question is always, well, what's the model that you think would be good out of the 59, Muslim states? They're not all Arab, but Muslim states. Which one is the best model for these folks in Judea and Samaria and Gaza? And there's just because none of those models are good for women. None of those models are good for prosperity or freedoms or even, alternative lifestyles. So I don't often understand what they're trying to achieve when the best place for Arabs to live, especially Arab women, is Israel, right? They can go to school, they have equal rights, they can become doctors or what have you. And I think that's where critical thinking seems to have fallen off the radar of our new generation, the upcoming generation. And I think a lot of us that are my age are not using their critical thinking. I mean, do you have any comments on that idea of, just like you said, there's all these facts that if we feel like if we can just show them to people, well, their light bulb should go on and they should say, I see, of course. What is your assessment of what's going on with the critical thinking of news consumers, social media consumers, and students?
It's interesting. First of all, as Jews and as rabbis, we're taught, and we're trained to read text in a critical fashion. And yet, suddenly, when something appears in the New York Times, we assume, oh, that must be true. There was just recently the gentleman who took that photograph that appeared on the front page of the New York Times was given the Pulitzer Prize. It was of a child who was, the caption indicated the child was starving. The photo was cropped, though, so that it didn't show his brother right next to him, who was very healthy. It also didn't indicate that the photo was taken pre-October 7th, nor did it indicate that the child had cerebral palsy, was not suffering from starvation.
It was
And
ill for other reasons.
exactly. And by the way, in fact, it was being treated, if I'm not mistaken, if not him, then others have been treated in Israel for that very same problem. And
Mhm.
so, nevertheless, the New York Times ran with that on the front page. They several days later were forced to write they did a very small correction. Similarly, within minutes of the bombing of a hospital, Al Shifa Hospital in Gaza, Hamas went out and they said this was done by Israel, and there are 500 people who were dead as a result. The New York Times ran with that. It was discovered within a week or two that it was a Hamas rocket, or actually it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired. It landed in the parking lot, not even in the hospital, and there were only a handful of people who were killed as a result of it, not 500. There again, the image had gone out, and so that's part of what we're dealing with is the acceptance, unquestioned acceptance of things, and in addition to that, the people sometimes are just plain ignorant, or I hate to say they're and I don't mean this to sound they're just I'll use the word lazy in terms of just going along with what is being said, and there just is a acceptance of this notion, and that's why our job is so important.
It is. And that I remember that New York Times article that came out because it wasn't too long after that I was up on Capitol Hill visiting with some lawmakers, and I had split with our group to visit different lawmakers. And I got a report back from one of my colleagues that when they went in there to that congressperson's office, he threw down the publication with that picture and said, "I don't want to hear anything you have to say. They're starving." I mean, he took that hook, line, and sinker, and that's a lawmaker who has the power to affect policy and, the different agreements between Israel and America. And it was so disheartening to see that even at the highest levels of
Sure.
responsibility in our country, our once trusted media has lost all its journalistic integrity, sound journalist. Okay, you understand people on TikTok and X, they say whatever they're going to say, but what has happened to our news agencies, whether it's, the broadcast media or the print media, in their lack of just the general way you're supposed to conduct journalism, which is, verifying sources, not taking the Hamas, what is it, the Hamas ministry numbers.
Information, yeah, or Ministry of Public Health. I've got two
Right,
different
right.
ones. Yeah. Not realizing that pretty much every hospital, every doctor is responsible to Hamas there. And so that were they to give a message that was anti-Hamas, it would not be one that would be accepted. People forget that it is a totalitarian dictatorship that Hamas controls,
Hmm. Hmm.
including the information that's allowed to get out.
So I know that we had, and maybe you can comment on this. So we all know about the horrific, I mean, we've heard the stories that trickled out, and we believed the women that survived, or the witnesses at the Nova Festival and in the kibbutzim, about the horrible sexual violence, right? Using that as a weapon. And it was denied, and people sat in the UN, and people sat on television shows saying it's doctored, it's AI, it's whatnot. And now we have another comprehensive report that has come out just recently, because victims are starting to share more, and you have to give those people time to be willing to do that. And I mean, it's thousands of incidences, both on October 7th, that the hostages suffered during their time in Gaza, whether it was the first group that came out in 6 weeks, or the ones that came out at the end. You know, what is your message to us, to leaders in the Christian community and everyday folks in the Christian community, and to your own community, to understand the trauma that has incurred, and how we can get ahead to both, I don't want to say minister, but comfort and be supportive to the entire Israeli community, and by extension, the community here in America, because my Jewish and Israeli friends here in America suffer with great emotional trauma about these things. And then these reports come out, and it brings it all to the surface. What are your words for us to comfort, and to be sure we're doing the right thing?
I think it's severalfold. First and foremost, the fact that there are Christian allies in the Jew to who work with us, who embrace us, who support Israel, who are willing to go to lobby on Capitol Hill. You have no idea how much that means to the Jewish community. Um, it, it's a time when we're feeling very isolated, we're feeling very alone, and so just that outreach means so much. After October 7th, I happened to be, or actually, it was after the shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue a couple of years ago. I happened to be just in the line checking out of the food line as I was buying some groceries. I was wearing my yarmulke, and the cashier that just expressed sympathy and support for us, and it meant so much. Those simple expressions mean a great deal because they remind us that there are good people. They remind us that we're not alone, and that's why that's so very important. Um, and I think to the extent it's to bring out truth, in the one of the previous conflicts in Gaza with Hamas, Bernie Sanders, who's been leading the charge against Israel for some reason, had said at the time, and I wrote an article about this in the Times of Israel. He said that there are 10,000 Palestinians who were killed by Israel. There were 10,000. This was a previous situation. There were 1,000. There were 1,000. He multiplied it by 10. And I wrote it. I said, it's because later on, he kinda, like, said, "Oh, okay." It's in his mind, there were 10,000. In other words, in his perception, because of the fact that Israel could do no right, because of the fact that he just assumed that Israel was doing all of these terrible, nefarious things, and so he went with that. And I think that's one of our responsibilities then, is to correct the distortions and the misperceptions, and to do what we can. Contact your members of Congress. Contact the media when they hold them responsible, when they write things and print things that are just not true. And I think those are tangible acts that can help.
And the other thing I wanted to touch on before we have to conclude is, we have a lot of elections coming up, and at the Jerusalem Connection, we don't endorse any candidate, and I'm sure, you can do whatever you want, but I want everybody to be fully aware that this stuff about the garbage in our K-12 schools, our local universities, it all is trickling up. So we need to understand who is running for our school board. If you don't get a chance to go to a public, a public hearing in your municipality or in your school board, most of them are recorded now or simulcasted online.
The thing is, I think we have to be very careful about the candidates. If somebody is, I'll say it, if somebody is endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America, make sure you vote against that person. They're asking people who are running for local school board, people are being policies about the Middle East. I said before you know it, someone running for the office of dog catcher is going to have to come out with a relations policy. It's getting that bad. And so we have to be vigilant because the other side is very, very, uh, make a very, very concerted effort to begin at the grassroots level and to work its way up. So we can't be asleep at the wheel in this.
And I will say that, the election of Mondami was very alarming.
Yes.
And I fear for New Yorkers, especially when they have the upcoming Jewish Heritage Month parade on May 31st. I'll be praying that day for sure. But there's other mini Mondamis coming up in DC and other locations. So it's really important that people are active at their local level. Doesn't matter if it's an R or a D after their name. Just look at, like you said, who is endorsing them, what is their platform, what are they saying? If they're on the school board, why are they, vilifying Israel at a school board meeting? That has no place there. So I think it's important that the Jewish community gets in front of its own, constituents, and the Christian community get in front of our constituents, our members, and say, you have to be active. There is a thread. I don't know if this is the same way in the Jewish community. There's a thread of pastors and churches in the umbrella of Christendom who don't want to get political, don't talk about politics, kind of like the Lutheran Church under the Hitler regime is like, just keep your head down, don't say anything, and everything will just be fine. What are your thoughts on getting from the pulpits and the podiums information out that might be perceived as political, but it's really about seeking truth and making sure that values are upheld in the elected levels?
100%. I think that the responsibility right now is to make sure that we don't hide behind nonpartisanship, which is very important, by the way, but nevertheless to try and call out those who are hate mongers, those who will try and subvert the nature of Western society and supplant it instead with hateful messages about Jews and about Israel. And I think in this case, by the way, and of course, it goes without saying that there are many friends we have within the Muslim community as well, thank God, who also understand and who also are every bit as turned off by this extremism in the Islamic community. So often this term of Islamophobia is just tossed around and they say it's to intimidate them. If anything, it's to shut down any criticism of the extremism within the Islamic community, of the fanaticism which seeks to and wipe out Judaism. And let's make no mistakes about it, when we look at what's happening in Africa, it's the Christian community that is being threatened there. If I can say this, and I hope I don't get into too much trouble for this, but I was really very surprised and disappointed that the leader of the Catholic Church was in Africa and did not say a word about the persecution and the killing of Christians in Africa by Islamist, fundamentalist, extremist, terrorist groups. It was an opportunity for him to speak out against that, and yet he did not. I don't understand it.
I don't
So there are
understand it
those
either
of us
because
who
there
have to
was a
be
lot of
allies.
Catholic communities. There is a diversity of Christianity in Africa, but certainly many of them were Catholic. And yes, it's infuriating that, I mean, we know the playbook. It's not a secret. It's first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And in
Yes.
Africa, there's not a lot of Jewish folks, so
They're
there's
going
more,
right to Sunday.
right? So they moved on to Sunday on that continent. Rabbi Weinblatt, we are so just privileged to have you join us and share your wisdom with us. And we are going to have you back and not wait 2.5 years, what we did last time. But we just are continuing to stand with our Jewish friends and neighbors, continuing the good work together. And I am going to reiterate your directives that you have to rabbis, to our Christian pastors and leaders, because I think just teaching your children and your children's children truth is the number one inoculation against all the poison of lies that are out there.
Thank you, Amy, so much. And thank you to everyone who was listening for your support. It means the world to us. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. If you enjoy these conversations, please visit us at www.thejerusalemconnection.us. Find all our podcasts on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast program. Follow us on social media, subscribe, like, and share our content to reach the broadest audience.